So, of the recent topics that I've recorded, the one that perhaps garnered the most feedback was the one with regard to the topic of Chachmas Chitzenius. And to perhaps just briefly recap, I cited this Rishim of the Tzemach Tzedek that goes on at great length about Bris Hamar, Bris Haloshen, and then there's this passage there, about 7 pages in, about the Chachmas Chitzenius, which is a pegam in Bris Haloshen of Torah, and he says, Haba Hatalia, that leads to a pegam in Bris Hamar. And I suggested that this is not stam avart, but it's referring to a certain mitzias in the style of the Chassidus of the Rebbeim, where they don't descend so deeply into describing the mitzias, but it's alluding to something specific. And I argued that it's alluding to the tzir, the scenario of someone heading to college to pursue a higher education, and that based on the history in Eastern Europe up until then, making that decision was perhaps close to guaranteed to lead someone to leave Yiddishkeit, and ultimately they could intermarry. And that's my reading and understanding and interpretation of this passage. And I implied that this is my understanding of the topic of Chachmas Chitzenius in Chabad Bechlal, starting all the way from the Alter Rebbe, Tanya, I guess you could say in Hilchos Talmud Torah as well, all the way down to the Rebbe Rashab strenuously rejecting any attempt to introduce the Talmidim, the Tmimim, to learn Chachmas Chitzenius, and he said that you touch it with one finger and you're verbrent. They're completely burned as a result of contact with Chachmas Chitzenius, and he pointed to specific examples of Yisrael Salanter, which again are cases where they were sent to pursue higher education, and they completely left Yiddishkeit, whether they completely shmadzich or lived their life out as a goy. This was the outcome that the Rebbe Rashab saw, that he diagnosed, and that explains his stance, and that, in my opinion, explains much of what Chassidus is saying on the topic in general, that it's not a general statement per se, it's being made within a specific context. We also discussed the concept of the Sheva Chachmas, which were the traditional areas of knowledge that were studied, pursued in higher education, by going to college, by going to university, and that also helps frame and shape what we're talking about when we say Chachmas Chitzenius. It's referring to the Sheva Chachmas. And the nafkamina being that there are other tchumim that perhaps colleges and universities study today, which may not be quite on the same level. They may not be important or good or worthwhile to study, but they might not necessarily be of the same caliber, or have the same belong to the same category as the traditional Sheva Chachmas. And in short, B'kitzur, I was saying that to apply what Chassidus is talking about, you need to be studying the Sheva Chachmas in some kind of university context, or in theory, you could be pursuing it yourself if you are pursuing it at the same level, pursuing the same curriculum, like the Rambam in his time, but that's pretty close to impossible. So, more or less, the scenario in which you would be pursuing the Chachmas Chitzenius would be pursuing these 7 areas of knowledge in a college, in a university context. So therefore, if you don't have all of those conditions, then it's not necessarily quite what Chassidus was talking about, like the Tzemach Tzedek, or the Rashab, or even perhaps the Alter Rebbe. So I got some feedback or some pushback to that, because certainly the standard Havana is that the Alter Rebbe says, Chachmas Chitzenius is Matam Chabad Shevanafshay, and the way it's read, the way it's understood, certainly the way it's commonly understood, is that any chachma that's not Torah is Matam Chabad Shevanafshay. So what exactly am I saying? What exactly am I proposing? What am I saying is perhaps okay, which others might think is not okay? So certainly welcome these questions, and the reason why I'm putting these recordings out there is certainly to receive feedback and to start a discussion, to get some feedback and reaction on my line of thinking. It takes a lot slower to get a reaction if you're just laboring at it alone. So certainly I'm happy that the ideas are getting out there, and people are sharing their thoughts and reactions to that. There's also the disclaimer, which I may have alluded to, which is that these are in no way intended or could possibly be fully thorough, meaning if we wanted to really study what the Rebbeim had to say about it, in my ideal scenario, I would sit down and I would search everything, all the Rebbeim ever said, which most people don't do melechatchila. They usually suffice with a few well-known makairos. So number one, I would go through every single makar of the Rebbeim, Dafka the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Marash, Rashab, Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe. Go through all of that, see what themes, ideas, patterns seem to emerge. Then perhaps study or think a bit about the context at the time, see if that shapes any of the patterns that emerge, and then take it from there. Then I'd have to figure out how to condense all that information into a presentation and both ensure that it contains all the relevant information and ensure that it comes across clearly to the audience. And then we could that would be the ideal way to start the discussion. But for many reasons, that's not practical. Interestingly, I'll point out that even the Rebbeim themselves are famously not so systematic. We find that the Rebbe in the early years, in the you could say the 1940s, wrote a few systematic pieces of research on certain topics. We know for whether it was Kavitz Lubavitch or whatever the publications were at the time, where the Rebbe for a time was responding to questions. And those are tremendously, not for me to say, but tremendously impressive pieces of work, of research that were very novel, certainly within the context that the Rebbe was coming from, but it is certainly more common in the less Hamish world to do. And I do think perhaps that itself is sort of the hallmark of the Rebbe's approach to research, and that the Rebbe had certain, you could say, perhaps more modern ideas of how to go about going through a topic, going through a sugya, trying to cover all the bases. That's not usually how Shalos Teshuvos are written, for those who spend time looking at that. And that itself is an interesting topic, interesting point in history of how often do we find from Rishonim and Achronim that they take a topic and really seek to go through it completely systematically, and how often is there more of a, maybe, someone's bucking Kol HaTorah Kula, or they've gone through enough that they feel confident making general statements, and then they'll bring a few rayas, or they'll address a few makairos, but there's less of a tradition. Certainly the Gemara itself, going back to the Gemara is not fully systematic in its discussions. These are larger, interesting questions, perhaps for other discussions as well. But the Rebbe certainly introduced a more systematic approach, and surely I would think encouraged it. And someone who would do that today, I think, would be following in the Rebbe's derech of seeking to do that. The Rebbe also published so much more material. Essentially, the Rebbe changed the defaults from just a few select titles of the Rebbe being printed to seeking to print all of it. And the more that's printed, the more of the ability we have to seek to see systematically what the Rebbeim said across all of their titles through all the generations. So that itself is an interesting point to think about. It's a different model towards how we approach studying, and towards how we approach reaching conclusions about what our views are, what our values are. This wasn't something that was necessarily possible in a previous day and age. Sometimes there may be pitfalls. Sometimes we talk about there are questions of hashkafa, or what our shittas are, and we try to go through all the Rebbe's sichos and all the Rebbe's letters and all the Rebbe's minus, and then there's almost perhaps the illusion that if we go through everything, then it all will become clear, whereas that's not necessarily the case. There may be unstated points that were never articulated that explain why the Rebbe said certain things, and another issue is that the record may never be complete. There may be one minor that never gets released that contains a crucial point that changes the entire equation. So sometimes being thorough, or believing that if you just go through all the texts one more time, you're going to reach the solution, that itself could be a fallacy. And these are questions that I think about. but still, mostly it seems worthwhile to try to find as many sources as possible. But there are other ingredients as well, in addition to that. Sometimes there's a Torah Sheba'al Peh, or there's a fifth Shulchan Aruch, whatever other terms you want to use to describe that sticking to the dry text itself isn't where it's all at. But at any rate, like I was saying, it's not the Rebbeim generally did not speak and write in such fashion, and they did make different points on different occasions, and it was left to others to either put it all together or just to have the right chosh to figure out what they actually mean, what's actually negei l'maisa. Like I was implying, certainly Amal 50 years ago, 60 years ago, was not within the means of any chassid to do that kind of research at all. And yet it was still assumed that the chassidim should be more or less on the right page and heading in the right derech. So even with the tools that we have today, it's not necessarily fair to expect that everyone can do that, and it's not necessarily the case that that was the expectation, that that's what everyone would do. So yeah, these are questions. These are points that need to be thought about and balanced in terms of how do we actually reach the truth? How do we actually get to the bottom of these questions? But at any rate, so again, on the one hand, that's not necessarily how people approached a topic. On the other hand, I do think that when we have these tools and we have these abilities, and certainly tools and abilities that I believe I have, it's certainly something I seek to do. And often seeing Makairos in this way can shed light and provide perspective that wasn't necessarily there. But on the other hand, it is always a tall order to go through a topic so deeply from beginning to end, and then to present it. So that's for the sake of this series, I am not seeking necessarily to do that. Instead, I'm sharing larger points that I've thought about over time, that have presented themselves to me, that I think have some merit, some value. And I am also looking to hear people's feedback, and if they have a particular Makairos that shed light that I haven't seen, then obviously that's great. So it's a bit more collaborative, and by no means the final word on any subject. But usually when I record something and share something, I believe that I'm adding something new to the conversation that I haven't seen be raised in the conversation before, that I think is very important, and the conversation shouldn't really go forward without taking this into consideration, but it's still part of an ongoing conversation. Essentially, really, in some sense, the Torah is an ongoing conversation. As I touched on I think the last recording, there are areas of Torah where it seems like the conversation has sort of been closed. If Shulchan Aruch paskin something, and that's how we do it. So even though back in the time of the Rishonim there could have been a larger range of views, but we have that feeling that this is closed, this is finalized. But there's certainly many other inyanim halachas that are not finalized in that way, and that itself is an interesting question about parts of Torah that lean more like this and lean more like that. And today, again, maybe there is like this illusion that everything should have a clear answer and everything should be reducible to a simple formula. And comes up, sometimes you'll see when more pashut people, less learned people talk about the Inyanim and Halacha, and they express a certain complex area of Halacha, and they try to reduce it to a formula they heard from a Rav, they heard in Yeshiva, and those who are more knowledgeable may groan internally. That's not. They're not actually summarizing it in a way that conveys all the complexity, and it can't be reduced to such a simple slogan or formula. And some things are just inherently complex, and some things are inherently not fully resolved, or inherently there are some contradictory ideas that have never been fully reconciled, or there hasn't been a clear hachra, and that's okay. But that itself requires perhaps more knowledge and more maturity in order to understand and appreciate, versus the way some things are represented in public. Obviously, here we're speaking sort of in generalities, and I'm sure I could give different examples, dogmois, of some of the points that I'm making, but that itself would be taking us off track here. This is just as a general akdama, perhaps shed some light a bit on my approach to this and how I'm thinking about it. So in this case, I think the point that I shared was a very valuable point or points, and sheds light and adds additional color and dimension to the discussion. It's not just reducible, in my opinion, to a simple Chachmas Quitzonius, Metame Chabad Shemanafshe, because what's the definition of Chachmas Quitzonius, or as I'll get to in a moment, what's the definition of Metame Chabad Shemanafshe? But this provides a lot more context that's, I think, needed. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that I've completely solved and resolved the entire issue and the entire question. So I want to now move forward and talk a bit more specifically about this statement, Chachmas Quitzonius, or Metame Chabad Shemanafshe. Now, another important point in Yesod and the way I approach things is that you have a statement like that, Metame Chabad Shebenafshe. Now, what do these words Metame Chabad Shebenafshe mean? So, Chabad, we know, Chachma bin Adas, these are terms from Kabbalah. And then we know that in Chassidus, and it's been pointed out, almost seems like in Chassidus Chabad in particular, these 10 Sfiris were also applied to the Nefesh Adam. It seems like that wasn't really common before Chassidus Chabad, and it still isn't necessarily common outside Chassidus Chabad, but in Chabad, that's a very central part of the entire framework, that the person himself, the Nefesh itself, has these 10 bechinas, and we use that, becomes part of the framework of how we talk about a person. And we say, Chabad Shemanafshe, obviously, in this case, we're talking about the elements of intellect that a person has, and that's being represented by the term Chabad Shebenafshe. But obviously, it's also using terms like Tuma, which is obviously a term, a word that we're familiar with from halacha or from more mystical contexts. But at some point, we have to realize and acknowledge that if you just repeat the words Metame Chabad Shebenafshe and imply that that's just a matter-of-fact type of statement that we all understand and we all relate to, then I think we're fooling ourselves to some extent. And I'll explain. When we use terms like Chabad Shebenafshe, so on the one hand, we are referring to the faculties of intellect in our mind. But on the other hand, when we speak in English about the faculties of intellect in our mind, the word tuma is not a word that we would use. We wouldn't say, no one in regular English without a mystical background says, you've contaminated the faculties of your mind, right? So you can use those terms in English, and I saw there's a discussion recently about chazering a maimer, chazering Chassidus in English, and not to use Hebrew buzzwords. And the question is, okay, and if you use English buzzwords, then have you accomplished much, right? So instead of saying Metame Chabad Shebenafshe, you'll say contaminated the faculties of your mind. So again, that perhaps creates the illusion that you've explained what that means, but it's not quite so. Because clearly there's some kind of mystical dimension here that we don't actually witness, we can't actually gauge, we can't actually measure. It's implying that our faculties have some kind of spiritual dimension. So saying Chabad Shebenafshe is not purely the material faculties of our mind, whatever definition, scientific definition you'd want to use for it, but it is assuming that they are animated by some kind of spiritual nefesh. And the nefesh corresponds to the kalim, the ark corresponds to the kalim, which is terminology Chassidus uses. So there's some kind of, obviously we know that if a person is not alive, then their mind certainly isn't working. So that the mind needs to be animated, and that animation is described to be the nefesh, or the koichus of a nefesh. And then we're assuming that nefesh has the capacity to be pure or the capacity to be contaminated. And we're saying that this contaminates the faculties or the spiritual nefesh part of those faculties within the nefesh. So there's a before and after where it was not contaminated, that it is contaminated. So these are all things that we believe, we study, we seek to understand, but it is also not something that we can certainly not observe, measure, engage, and the guy walks into the room and then walks out of the room, and you can say, oh, well, okay, I can tell this person was Metame Chabad Shebenafshe. It's clearly not working quite like that. So the question is, what do we make of these statements? So I think there are perhaps at least two general approaches. The general approach that I've observed is sort of to take it as granted, as fact, without being able to actually use any indicator, use any measure as to whether this is the case. So if Chassidus says, and I assume that X, Y, and Z is Chacham Spontaneous, so therefore if a person learns it perhaps for, 5 minutes, so then we can therefore assume and conclude they were Matamech Chabad Shebenafshe. So I don't really know what any of those words in that sentence mean, but Chassidus says so, and those are the teachings that we abide by. That's what we believe. So that must Muzman Zagen. We must say that a person was Matamech Chabad Shebenafshe. So essentially, these are all words that we don't fully understand. We don't really know. We're just repeating them and you could say parroting them. But we're saying it with confidence. We know it to be true. We know if the word tumah is a bad word. So the person was Matamech Chabad Shebenafshe. We know that can't be good. So we're confident that this was bad for them in the sense of Matamech Chabad Shebenafshe, which has something to do with the mind, but that's about it. That's one way. I hope I'm not reducing it too much. It's not too reductive, but that's one approach. That seems to be the more prevalent approach. The approach, the Mahalach that I would like to introduce, and that was implied by my presentation, is that what Chassidus is doing is it's trying to bridge two things. It's trying to bridge a certain mitzias, a certain observable mitzias reality. That's in this case we're talking about problems. We're talking about spiritual problems, spiritual afflictions. We can certainly measure spiritual afflictions. We can look at a guy without using Chassidic terminology at all. We could look at a guy and say, okay, this guy is a Chassidish guy, an Edel guy. His mind doesn't seem to be occupied with any outside stuff, any nonsense. He seems to have his head on straight. Look at another guy and say, okay, this guy seems to be mixed up with nonsense. He's not as chassidish, not as edel, not as refined. These are all non-technical, advanced terms. These are things that we can observe with our own eyes and talk about. So there's that. And then there is an entire complex kabbalistic system, which is supposed to be the underlying spiritual system that explains the mechanics of our world. And Chassidus Chabad in particular took that and built on that and added more detail and more dimension, particularly the Alter Rebbe. This is a big, to really appreciate what the Alter Rebbe was doing, you have to understand what the terminology and framework was before and how much the Alter Rebbe added and introduced and how many terms and concepts he added to the discussion. And he created an entire framework that we now use and take for granted. And the way I would describe it, the way I would present it, explain it is that when the Alter Rebbe says a statement like Matamech Chabad Shebenafshe, he's bridging a certain observable mitzias with certain terminology, and in order for someone coming from that angle, someone who actually is very bahavan, very proficient in the kabbalistic system, and the kabbalistic system was almost alive for him, which it really is for us. So there is this complex three-dimensional kabbalistic, it's like the physics, or in this case, obviously more the metaphysics of the world, right? So I guess in the mashal, someone who is trying to understand someone's machla. So first you have to look at the symptoms. You have to get the report from the patient on what pain they're experiencing. But then you can look under the microscope and use a whole different set of terminology to describe the mechanics of what's happening underneath. But you need to be strongly proficient in both. And someone who just speaks in technical terms but doesn't actually understand those technical terms, it could sound impressive, but do you really understand what you're talking about? And what benefit, what value are we gaining from using these overly technical terms? So I think someone like the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbeim, are coming from both observing certain realities and from having a very strong command of this technical world. And the Alter Rebbe is putting a label on it, putting a term of Matamech Chabad Shebenafshe, which expresses both the observable mitzias and the underlying metaphysics within this system, within the terminology of this system. Now, speaking for myself, for the people I know, whatever my grasp is on these kabbalistic terms, on these chassidic terms, I don't think that maybe I'm wrong, but the people that I know, I don't think we really grasp this kabbalistic system to that extent, to that degree, where it's alive, it's three-dimensional, and it all clicks. I think what we're doing is we're trying our best to learn as many statements, as many passages as possible, and look for some measure of internal logic, so that we can use the terms and phrases appropriately and not make a mockery, a fool out of ourselves. But often, this is somewhat of a criticism. Often when you see shtiklach Torah, pulpulim, and it's getting into these technicalities, using technical terms and saying, well, here it says these technical terms and there it says those technical terms, so does that shtim, does it not, does it fit, does it not, maybe this, maybe that. At some point, the question becomes like, do you know what you're talking about? What are you even talking about? And I've seen that the Rebbe himself in the Mems once repeated from the Rebbe Rashab that there was a Talmud that somewhere in Chassidus talks about the different colors of the flame within the fire. There's the blue flame and there's the whatever other colors there are. And this Talmud was getting very fartan in the technicalities of the flames, and until at some point the Rebbe Rashab said, like, what are you talking about? You're talking about colors of flames? Like, what are you saying? This seems to express this point where at some point we need to check in and double check. Do these words mean anything to you? What exactly are you doing? Are you saying with them? And this is a larger issue, I think, even in areas of halacha, where I think halacha often also gets sort of reduced to these external technical terms, and then you can create a whole pilpul moving these terms around. But like, what do these terms even mean to you, or do they not mean anything? And I think gradually over time you can see a shift in different times, different places, different types of writing, where you could sort of start questioning, or you could tell whether someone actually really knows what they're talking about, or they're creating a good show out of sounding impressive by having lots to say, but without ever fully grasping the actual terms that they're discussing. So in this case, we have this term, matame Chabad shebenafshe. Now, I'm not an expert. I can't measure and gauge Chabad shebenafshe per se, and I certainly can't measure the degree of tuma Chabad shebenafshe. The only way that I could speak about it meaningfully is by trying to find corresponding real-life terms and real-life mitziasin that can make a bit more sense. Now, there are some areas of spirituality and Kabbalah and Chassidus. Let's take chametz on Pesach, for example. Chametz on Pesach is something the Torah says is aser, and Kabbalah and Chassidus, in Kabbalah and Chassidus, it's strongly implied that eating chametz, even a mashru chametz, has spiritual harm. So Chassidim, Chabad, we go crazy on Pesach to avoid even a mashru chametz, presumably because of the fear of that spiritual harm. So that's not a case where I would be seeking to give any rational or down-to-earth framework based on observable reality, because that seems to be the entire idea, that it's completely taking place on a spiritual realm, and spiritual harm wouldn't be immediately observable. If someone did have a mashru chametz, we wouldn't be able to say, oh, we see the harm, but it would have long-term spiritual deleterious effects. There may be some other examples of that, but those are things that I think part of it is that these are things that are mentioned in Torah, and that's its own category. Negelwasser, things like that. We're not going to do a study and a test to see what the harm is. It's beyond what we can observe. But I think when it comes to inyanim that are not isurei Torah, so when it's expressed in these terms that it's a klipa, it's metame Chabad shebenafshe, my tendency, my mahalach is to say that we need to first find the observable mitzias, the observable reality, and like I said, then I think it's bridging the reality with a spiritual framework and expressing it in spiritual terms, but the mitzias does come first. So in this case, the question or the test would be, do we treat it as radioactive chametz aser b'mashahu, or not necessarily? Maybe that would prove which category it belongs to. So if chachmas chitzonius is any use of the mind, any bit of knowledge that's not Torah, So, like I may have mentioned, why is the sky blue, or counting to 10, or what's the heter to teach children numbers, which is a form of an alphabet. It's obviously not letters, but it's a system that's not aleph beis, and spending their minds, using their minds to try to wrap their mind around addition, subtraction. It's a shtickle chachma. What's the heter, and why is it not ever discussed? Where's the discussion? Where's the heated discussion as to whether you're allowed to teach your children basic addition, subtraction? I think this demonstrates that the lack of a good logical framework for understanding what we're talking about, both in terms of what chachmas chitzonius are, and in terms of what metame chavat shemanafshe means. If you don't have that, it's going to lead you to some perhaps pretty absurd conclusions. Now, some of us, if you hang around Oli Torah long enough, you may actually find it's not completely mufrach, completely upgefrekt to find a kid who literally might not know almost anything about the universe besides what they were taught in Cheder. So it's not, I can't act like that's completely unheard of, but I am very dubious as to whether that's really the kavana, and for a number of reasons, and most of which, part of what I want to get to, is the approach of the Rebbeim, certainly of the Fidik Rebbe and the Rebbe. We see that in the last Doiros, when there was a question of teaching secular studies in yeshiva, it was not considered Yeharik Valyaver. It wasn't considered something that was non-negotiable. The Rebbe obviously indicated that he would prefer not, although it depends where. Out of town, in town, you can start going down that whole route. But it does not seem, and this is more advanced than just teaching your child, how to count to 10, etc. But it also falls many levels below studying chachmas in college. So what we're seeing here is that it's not all or nothing. It's not any chachma, anything that's any use of your mind, any use of your intellect that's not Torah. Rather, we could break it down. There's studying Sheva Chachmas in college. They're studying perhaps other so-called Chachmas in college. Then they're studying the high school version of it, or the elementary school version of it, or even not the elementary school version of it, but just some basic facts about life. There are many tiers here, many levels here, and there's no systematic discussion about what falls into what spiritual category. But from the general sense that we get, even though, like I said, there may be some yechidim where it's almost like they succeed at taking the most expansive definition literally, but that's not what we see in terms of what the Rebbeim were willing to accept. And even if the Rebbe indicated that he would prefer that schools, at least in the more Hamish neighborhoods, communities, don't have secular studies, even there it's not clear what the issue with the secular studies per se is. Is it the etzem knowing some basic mathematics, some basic arithmetic, or, as the Rebbe indicated in a few places, that there is a musik of learning at Altaras HaKodesh, and really the term Altaras HaKodesh means studying that in the halachic context, it's chulin Altaras HaKodesh, that you eat your chulin, you eat your non-holy, your mundane food on the same level as you would the kodesh, the holy, the sacred food. And similarly, the Rebbe, in a number of places, it's pretty clear that Altaras HaKodesh actually doesn't mean, Altaras HaKodesh is not just, or in the sense that it's commonly understood today, which is that you have to keep it purely Kodesh, but rather that there is chulin, but the chulin is studied Altaras HaKodesh. And that people pointed to a sikh of the Rebbe in the 80s, where the Rebbe seemed to indicate studying other subjects, but it should be integrated within Torah. Obviously, the basic argument is that there are many areas of Torah that require understanding a basic grasp of addition, subtraction for sure, or even a basic grasp of aspects of geometry or other basic such knowledge. And all we know, realistically speaking, practically speaking, is that we know that Rebbeim didn't like going to college, and they didn't like imposing a full secular study curriculum in school if you could avoid it, but it's not the end of the world if you can't avoid it. So based on the practical examples that we're familiar with, there's no support for the stance that we have to treat every single little bit of anything that constitute a chachma as chachmas chitzonius that are matameh Chabad shebenafshe. So I think my starting point is that taking it to the extreme proves the absurdity of such a stance. That stance is clearly not tenable with anything that we're familiar with. And we don't see the Rebbeim reacting to such cases with that reaction of, well, so it's not like chametz, it's not like stuff of that nature. It clearly is either there's some unstated definition that we're missing. So one way would be of saying perhaps it's literally only studying Sheva Chachmas in college, and that's the missing definition that everyone's overlooking. Or perhaps it's there are tiers, or it's staggered, or it's not a blanket statement, or it's subjective, or it depends on the case. There has to be more nuance here in approaching this question. So, like I said, there are two questions here. What's the definition of Chachmas Chitzonius? So that's what I've been focusing on the last couple of minutes. But there's also the question of what's the definition of Matami Chabad Shebanafshe. If it's just a statement that we can understand, then it's very hard to have this kind of discussion and figure out what applies where. But if we're able to use some rational framework, some reality-based framework to say that Alter Rebbe is using spiritual terms to describe observable reality, then that's something we could try to nail down and pin down and figure out. So again, let's take the most extreme example. Someone who grew up, whether in the shtetl or today in a very chassidic environment, and they weren't exposed to other stuff, and then suddenly they go and they start studying the Sheva Chachmas in college. Like I said, we could certainly see many examples of people where that certainly caused harm, tremendous spiritual harm in the past, and even in the present. Those who go completely out to that environment, it's a davar pasha, the observable reality that it has immense spiritual harm. So if the Alter Rebbe wanted to come along and say, "Oh, you see that spiritual harm? Let me explain to you in kabbalistic terms. Das heißt, metame Chabad shebenafshe." Oh, so that sits a lot better with me. And now I understand that the Alter Rebbe is using these advanced spiritual terms to give a spiritual name to the reality that we observe, that this person really messed up. Now the question is it only in a case that's that extreme, or is it possible that there's at least a measure of that in lesser cases? In which case, how seriously do we have to take it in those lesser cases? There's also the question of, is that literally the only thing that can harm someone spiritually? There are plenty of other things a person can do which are not purely intellectual that could also harm them spiritually if they're sitting and watching Gaish entertainment of different kinds. We're not going to start listing and enumerating them all, but it could be music, it could be visual. That certainly also harms people spiritually. What is the exact spiritual terminology for that in Alter Rebbe's terminology? I don't know exactly. We can clear. To me, it's not necessarily even so important to find the exact terminology, because that kabbalistic world isn't as vividly before my eyes. That I'm not looking for the exact kabbalistic definition. But to me, the kabbalistic definition is secondary to the realistic definition, which is that there are many things that could cause spiritual harm to someone, and whether it's purely, strictly, specifically Chabad shebenafshe, or some other whatever the appropriate terms would be, we can see that people can be harmed spiritually, intellectually, or in other facets, other levels of their being, and so instead of just using terms that we don't understand and trying to apply the terms that we don't understand, let's try to work off the harm that we do understand, that we can observe, that we learn about from experience, and focus on that. And let's start with the greater harms, the ones that seem to leave the most lasting long-term harm, and then we can work back from that to things that don't seem so harmful. Again, if it's chametz, then we don't really distinguish. But in this area, based on everything we see from the Rebbeim, it doesn't seem like we treat it like chametz. It seems like we are talking about observable reality. Even the Rebbe Rashab, when he was taking very hard line stance, he was talking about observable reality. He wasn't saying that someone who learns it, it harms them spiritually. He was saying when they learn it, it's going to mess them up. They're not going to come out the same the way they came in. So we need to apply that model to the discussion these questions of what can we absolutely not tolerate, and what does it appear that we can tolerate somewhat, again, especially depending on what your standards are for other things. Are you allowing Jewish music into your home that has a very, what we would consider to be a very goyish sound to it, which you can draw the line. If you're exposed to the goyish Jewish music, that's perhaps a gateway to even more goyish music and more goyish, until it's actual goyish music, until it's the goyish music environment, and people have certainly gone off from being pulled into the goyish music environment. That's another very negative environment that a person could be pulled into today, in parallel to being pulled into a college environment. Do I know which spiritual faculties a person's metame when they get pulled into a goyish music environment? No, I don't know. And there are no clear definitions in Chassidus about music, goyish music. People often seek to create a rule and generalize where there is none. There is no clear statement anywhere that I'm aware of about the specific negative harm of a melody that comes from not a holy place. But it's more based on observable reality. Observable reality is that somewhere along the way, people can get spiritually harmed, and so we're trying to work around the what we observe, and trying to, but also work with the limitations that seem normal and reasonable, and we're trying to keep people away from things that might be spiritually harmful. But as long as you're not talking about going to an actual mosh pit at some concert somewhere, it's very hard to put down clear lines as to what is okay, what's not okay. There are just many levels, and each one is, you could say, slightly worse than the next. And different people, different families, different environments. It's certainly not possible for many people to keep their family, keep their children in a completely sterile environment. And even if you could conceivably attempt to do so, doing so itself may not be advisable and could backfire as well. Again, this is just based on observable reality. So, just as this is the case with music, where mlachatchila there are no clear spiritual definitions, there's no statement in Tanya about music anyway, but we more or less were faced with the same range of concerns, and every person, every family lands somewhere on the spectrum. I think that's the case for any chachma or any yediyah that's not purely Toradic. Like I alluded to, first of all, a lot of these ideas are negayah to Torah, and there's a muskal Taras HaKodesh. There's still no clear tradition on that either. Certainly, going back a few hundred years till today, there are some families or some circles that lean hard towards not even having those ideas to understand what the Torah is talking about. Certainly, we don't lack for examples of people learning parts of Torah and not really understanding the Metzias at all. Then you have a range of being exposed to different ideas. Are you going to buy your children a book that teaches them about animals? Are you going to show them a dictionary? Basic things. Some families avoid it. Some families take it for granted that's obviously just basic normal ideas for a child to have. And historically, among Chassidim as well, I think there was a range of behavior. There was no, it wasn't like Chametz on Pesach. There wasn't one size fits all. I think more Gvidish families tended to give their children more of an education. I think even the Rebbe himself, people asked me, maybe some Nalabavitchers mentioned in that whole discussion about the Rebbe's own practice of the Rebbe studying Chachmas. I answered, we said in Chabad, we don't talk about the Rebbe studying higher Chachmas as something that's relatable, negate to other people, so I didn't want to go into that. But I do think it's somewhat fair game to mention that I believe when the Rebbe grew up at home, I believe there was some other studying that they did that wasn't purely Torah. And that was just an example for people that lived in, perhaps in the larger cities, or had a more chash of a family, whether obviously Gvidim, but maybe even Rabbanim as well. They wanted their children to be a bit more well-rounded. That seems to have been considered within the range of acceptable behavior. It wasn't a black and white, aser al tamashu chametz. It's also possible that some of this is somewhat subjective, that for a child from a certain background, from a certain time in a certain place, then maybe even exposure to even the smallest amount of ideas chitzonius could have been harmful. Whereas someone who milchatchila grew up in a more cosmopolitan environment, so you're a bit more immune. And this fits in with my understanding. This is that we don't necessarily have completely fixed definitions here. We're not working with we're not working with a definition of chametz. And that would also explain, living here in America, sort of by definition, there's certain things maybe we're not exposed to that kids in the Shtetl may have been exposed to, but there's certainly much that we seem to be exposed to that they weren't exposed to, and that's just part of the price of living life in this day and age. And we're not trying to raise human beings in a sterile environment. Chassidus also talks about the effects that Tanugim Gashmim have, also very strongly deleterious spiritual effects, and yet even most regular, standard, normal Chassidic families are not treating Tanugim Gashmim like it's radioactive, like it's a mashu chametz. So that also gives you some perspective on what. How we think about it, how we approach it, how we deal with this sugya. So can I answer yes or no about all these other levels, all these other dargas of yidiyas? Are they chachmas chitzonius or not? Spiritually speaking, I don't know if I could give a clear, full, definitive definition. Are they metame Chabad shebenafshe or not? I can't give you a full, clear definition, but we're being surrounded by all kinds of other things that are being metame us to some extent or another, and that's part of life. The Alter Rebbe describes someone being in the marketplace and how challenging that is spiritually, and no one suggested that therefore we should try our hardest to keep people out of the marketplace. That's also part of life. So certain things can be considered to be part of the price of life, and part of the price of being a functioning human being. That could also be part of it. So maybe technically teaching your child how to count to 10 is mildly metame Chabad shebenafshe. For all I know, I can't tell you for sure. But maybe it is. But maybe that's the price that we need to pay to be able to function in this world. We need to be able to count to 10. So if he had only ever learned Aleph Beis and never learned how to count 1 to 10, he would be somewhat more spiritually refined. And now that he was taught how to count from 1 to 10, now that the shtickle eitz hadas, he was opened, exposed to epis beyond the Daled Amos shel Torah. But that's part of what it takes to be a normal human being, and you'll have to deal with that and all the other nonsense that we have to deal with and encounter and interact with throughout our lives. And a lot of it is not especially spiritually helpful, but that's just that's part of the price of living life. So maybe it is, or maybe it's not. Maybe it makes more sense to say that it's not metame Chabad shebenafshe, or it's not metame the Chabad, it's metame something else, or it's not metame. But like I said, I'm not going to throw the words around because I don't have the knowledge, the spiritual knowledge, and the tools to keep on creating new spiritual definitions. All I can talk about is what we can observe. And what we can observe is that perhaps even the slightest thing can have some negative spiritual impact, but there are other considerations. We don't treat it like it's radioactive. The only thing we do find is pretty consistently that the Rebbeim were, again, studying higher, certainly the Sheva Chachmas, maybe in this day and age, studying other non-Sheva Chachmas could also, in a college environment, would probably also be equally as harmful. Historically, those weren't offered. Now they are offered. So that's another crack at this framework from the opposite angle. That's not just Sheva Chachmas today. It could be other things as well. But we find that, in particular, the Rebbeim were opposed to going to college, and that's what the Tzemach Tzedek seems to be hinting at. That's certainly the kind of thing that the Rebbe Rashab was talking about. To a great extent, or perhaps bringing something to that extent, something equivalent to that into the yeshiva to create some kind of mixture that would be completely like some kind of combination of yeshiva and university. But when it came to the Friedrich Rebbe, when it came to elementary and high school secular studies, and that itself could also depend on the environment, that if you were Ingela from the Shtetl, then maybe even elementary school and high school studies would have been close to equally as harmful. Whereas if you live in America and you're already exposed to X, Y, and Z, or back in the shtetl, you didn't speak English. So even being exposed to, even teaching a child how to speak Russian would have been a gateway to a lot of Goyishkeit that they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. Whereas today, by knowing English, that already is a shtickle gateway. So the very fact that your children know English is spiritually harmful to some extent, because they're that much more able to be exposed to other stuff, right? You go to the chassidic world where they speak much less English, so their ability to be exposed to certain things is diminished. And these are all just observable. These are all decisions you can make. You can say, I'm going to keep this out of my child's education because X can lead to Y. Or you can say, look, the Metzias is that doesn't seem tenable, sustainable to try to draw the line here. At this point, we're exposed to X, Y, and Z anyway. Let's draw the line over there. So there seems to be a large area where there's room for being pragmatic, following the Metzias. Whether or not it is Chachmas, whether or not it's Metame, again, I can't tell you for sure. But in the pure classical sense, it seems like we're talking about something much more severe. And whether you can be more machmir and bigger karnoi in the lesser degrees of it might be more subjective, might depend on the time, on the place, on the particular person, on the family, on the community, on the yeshiva. But this seems like a much more realistic framework that both accounts for what Chassidus says, but also accounts for how it was implemented in practice by Chassidim, by the Rebbeim over time. I think this provides just a more, I don't know if rational is the right word, but just a more comprehensive, more understandable, more communicable framework that can allow us to discuss rationally or intelligibly about what our views on the matter are and where to draw the line. Now, someone pointed out to me that there are places in Chassidus where it does get a bit more into the definition of Chachmas Chitzonis, and it seems to be implied that it's like the etzem. I don't know if I'm repeating it mikli sheni here, but I'm going to try to roughly approximate what I think the idea may have been, which is that by focusing on other chachmas, so you're focusing on what's outside of the Eibishter, or you're focusing on the yeshus of the world, and thereby you're perhaps creating more yeshus within yourself, or whatever the exact term, the exact description was. And while I didn't have a chance to look it up and to see for myself what it says, what it doesn't say, I would like to respond and propose the following, which is that there are likely also degrees to what we mean when we say studying Chachmas Chitzonius. That also needs to be defined, which is also relevant to the previous discussion as well. How much of your mind and how much of your actual care and concern are you actually dedicating to studying the Chachmas Chitzonius? I think to some extent, when Chassidus talks about Chachmas Chitzonius as a threat, I think it's talking about people who just like there was the classic education, there was a classic desire for education. Someone who wanted to be intelligent, to feel intelligent. They genuinely wanted to grasp, they wanted to learn these subjects. I think today, to some extent, it's almost hard to relate to, because even though the country and the West still kind of runs a lot on attending college and studying, but I think it's been observed by many that there is much less of an actual desire to be enlightened, to be knowledgeable, to have that knowledge, to have that grasp. The way it's comparable to the way someone who genuinely strives to become a Talmid Chacham, to become a Gadol B'Torah, that thirst that they have, people have a genuine thirst within the Jewish world to really acquire that knowledge, to really reach a certain level of knowledge, of understanding, and it's a thirst equivalent to that used to be quite common, certainly among the non-Jewish intellectual circles. They genuinely wanted to reach that level of enlightenment and understanding, and there may have been pockets among the Jewish world who also had a similar craving, and that was being addressed, that was being responded to. And therefore their studying would have also been commensurately very passionate, really trying to understand the foundations of these teachings, of these fields of knowledge. They're really trying to reach that level of understanding. And I think Chassidus could be acknowledging that and addressing that and saying, if you're going to apply your mind and your desire to these other chachmas the way you would otherwise apply it only to Torah, so whatever you're connecting with when you do that with Torah, so we describe out that you're connecting to the Eibishter in this unbelievable way. So if you apply your mind in that very same way to these other areas of Chachma, what do you think you're connecting yourself to? Where do you think those areas of Chachma come from? You're connecting yourself to essentially the opposite. These Chachmas come from Klippa, I guess you could say. I'm sure there are more details and there's more to the spiritual framework for those that are interested in getting that those technical terms 100% accurate and straight. Like I said, to me, it's while the kabbalistic terminology is important, and I strive to be proficient in it, but the terminology isn't so negay necessarily to the Havana. You have to be able to really understand it almost stripped of kabbalistic terminology, and if you don't, then if you can't, then I don't know if you really understand it. So what I think the idea being expressed in this type of context is that we know from Kabbalah, from Chassidus, Eibishter created this entire alternate system of Tuma, and to some extent the entire existence of the world. We use terms like Klippa. Perhaps in Chabad we use Klippa more than Tuma, or Sitra Achra, but these things are obviously related. So if you're delving into the Metzias Ha'olam, the Chachmas that deal with the Metzias Ha'olam, and you're delving into it with the same amount of passion, and you're sort of trying to connect to something, you're trying to reach some point beyond you. So what do you think you're striving towards? Where do you think you're digging towards? Whatever you're going to hit at the end, that's not God, that's not godliness. That's essentially the opposite. Again, without getting into whatever I'm not going to give you a name of a Tumah or a Malach or a Klippa, but that's functionally what you're doing in that scenario. Now, I'm not saying there's no one like that today, but like I said, even within the non-Jewish world, it's far less prevalent to actually have that she'ifa, to have that desire, to have that thirst. It's everything in Tanya's terms. There's Chassidus and Dvarim B'Teilim. I think much of what passes for Chachma today is closer to the area of Dvarim B'Teilim. But more importantly, it's rare to have that desire to truly reach that pinnacle of knowledge, understanding, and enlightenment. And to sum up, bottom line, I think we have to. Very important ingredient here, in my opinion, is you have to follow the Metzias. You have to observe the actual spiritual pitfalls, the actual negative spiritual ramifications we see in different scenarios. So going to college and studying Chachmas, whether it's the traditional Chachmas or at this point hanging out and studying whatever they study in college, obviously is the most harmful. And I think that's what the Rebbeim were speaking about a big percentage of the time, even if it's not fully articulated and expressed. In addition to that, having that desire, having that thirst to reach whatever one believes to be this pinnacle of enlightenment is also very harmful and at odds with the desire one should have if one is pursuing true spirituality as taught by Kabbalah and Chassidus. Otherwise, anything that falls short of that, you sort of have to observe it on a case-by-case basis and see what are the outcomes. How negative is it? How much does it take away from pursuing a spiritual life? I think for many people, you could say living in an out-of-town community with a weaker school and more limudei chayil, as they're called, and we do have that distinction in terms. We use limudei chayil versus chachmas chitzonius. But even living in an out-of-town school where there's just a lot of limudei chayil and there's a lot of sports and there's other aspects of pop culture that are very prevalent, is probably pretty harmful in its own rights. And again, without needing to have kabbalistic terms to explain it, we can observe that that's perhaps not what we want for our children. But I think if we just stuck to that framework and we are aware of the really extreme bad case scenarios, and then we are aware of the lesser, somewhat more subjective, somewhat more up to individual choice, the different cases, the different negative effects that are out there, then I think it is more up to individuals to decide what they think is the right balance for them. And of course, even as was pointed out, the Rebbe did allow certain people under certain circumstances to go for certain studies. But let's say you have to keep in mind as well that today studying to become an accountant may count as going to college. But is that really college in the traditional sense, or is that just institutions of higher education just creating more and more tracks for more and more employment paths and just giving it a title and giving it a name? That's not necessarily Chachmas Chitzenis in the classical sense at all. So the Rebbe, if the Rebbe allowed people, often it was after they got married, or even if it wasn't, or depending on their background, which also, like I said, is a factor in the decision. What's the family background? What type of dynamic are we talking about? But often it's to study more practical fields. Practically speaking, it's perhaps more akin to attending a trade school, even if that's not what it's officially called. Studying computers is not a classical chachma in the sense of the Shabbat chachmas. You're not studying the nature of the world in any sense. It's just a somewhat intellectual, non-Torah, non-chachma field. So that's also important to keep in mind. These distinctions are also important. And it's very clear that there is more room for, there's more leeway depending on the scenario. But if someone comes along and says that in addition to studying Torah, in addition to getting to the bottom as far as I can, as much as I can, of Torah, of Halach, of Chassidus, I also feel that I need to be a Chacham, Yani Chachmas Olam, that's a lot closer to what Chassidus is talking about. And like I said, I think that's fairly uncommon. And in that case, even if one didn't go to college, even if one was determined to somehow do it, to go it alone, and one got all the advanced college level textbooks and was studying Be'iyun to be Masig l'Shavach Chachmas, so yeah, I guess technically that would also be along the lines of what Chassidus is warning about. But that itself is not very common. Going to college is far more common, and that whole package deal is very clearly Metami Chabad Shemanafshay and has very negative effects, like the Tzemach Tzedek described. I hope that sheds some light and provides some more clarity on what I was seeking to say. I'm sure this still leaves room for more discussion, and I'm, of course, always happy to hear more feedback.